My name is Jim Gurnett. I've been part of the planning committee for this conference over the past month. We're going to look frankly at some of the difficulties and challenges and tougher parts of that story today, but we're also going to have opportunity to share success stories and to gather your own ideas, as you've seen in the program. And so it's going to be a day of diverse learning that involves all of us. I want to start by just recognizing that this conference would only be possible thanks to a number of sponsors that have provided the financial resources to make it happen. Our lead sponsor is the Alberta Real Estate Foundation, and they've been supported by the City of Edmonton, the Edmonton Community Foundation, Edmonton Public Library that's freely made all their space available over these 2 days, by Homeward Trust, and by the University of Alberta's Community Service Learning, which enabled us to have a student who's been working with us for all through the planning process and done a huge amount of the groundwork to make this conference possible. So here we are to begin learning. Because we need to keep us moving, I'm not going to take up time to present bios about our presenters. We've got tremendous people, and you can read all about them in the program booklets, and we're going to be able to learn from them. We're not going to have opportunity, except in the period of time between 11:10 and 12:10, in these first 2-hour blocks. We're not going to have time to interact with questions and discussion with them, but when we break at 10:40, as you go to the information fair to learn from organizations in the next room, you'll also maybe be able to grab some of those presenters from these first 2 blocks of time. So we're going to begin with 2 key presentations that kind of set the scene and educate us both nationally and locally. We'll begin by having Michael Shapcott back with us, that many of us had the chance to begin learning with last night. And Michael's going to be followed by Jay Freeman, who provides leadership here in the City of Edmonton around housing and homelessness issues. So I welcome both of you, and Michael will turn things over to you. Thank you very much.
So I happen to know that Jay is going to start with a deep cultural reference, so I want to start with another deep cultural reference, and that's Oliver Twist. And if any of you know the great Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist, you'll remember that one of the many memorable moments in his story was when the young Oliver is in an orphanage, and he's given very generously a thin bowl of gruel by the overseer, and he decides that he's still hungry, so in the midst of all these people, he walks up to the table where the overseer and the beadle and all the other officials are eating their roast goose with his little bowl and says, "Please, sir, may I have some more?" And sometimes when we think about the right to housing, we kind of get stuck in the Oliver Twist mode, that somehow we have to go to the government or the United Nations or to Edmonton City Council or to the Alberta Legislature and say, "Please give us the right to housing." That's not the way it works. The right to housing exists. It's not up to governments to say whether we deserve it or not. It's enshrined in international law. Canada is a signatory to dozens, in fact there's 95 pages of treaties which Canada is a signatory, and it recognizes the right to housing. And then the key point is recognized. It's not that the government decides that we're going to have that right, but maybe not some other rights. We have that right. So that's one thing that's really important to remember. So get Oliver Twist out of your brain. Never think that we are now going to government and saying, "Please, we're in a desperate situation, give us some housing, give us our right to housing." I quoted a doctor, Dr. Ursula Franklin, who said that Canada's national housing crisis and homelessness disaster was a man-made crisis. It's manufactured, and that's where I want to pick up today. It's a manufactured crisis. It's not that the creator or the goddess or whatever it is out there in the universe decided to punish us because we're bad. It's not some freak act of nature, El Nino, El Nina, global climate change or whatever. It's a manufactured crisis. In 1973, our national government, I said this last night as well, all of of you who are paying attention will remember it was Honourable Ron Basford in 1973 introducing the National Housing Act and Canada's National Housing Program of 1973, saying housing is a right of every Canadian and it's the responsibility of government to ensure that right is realized. So for those Canadians who can't get their homes by going out and buying one or by renting one in the private market, governments have a responsibility to step in and to work on those issues. So, but I pointed out that when in the 1990s we began to see governments cutting back on and eliminating housing programs at the national level and so on, that we began to generate mass homelessness in Canada. And I'm not entirely sure about you here in Edmonton, but in the 1970s and 1980s, when I was a community organizer in downtown Toronto, I saw mostly middle-aged and older men who were homeless, sometimes a few women, never saw a family. I remember the first time I saw a family and I was shocked. And I remember in early 1994, the first time I met a pregnant woman who was homeless, I thought, how could this be in our country that we have a pregnant woman who's homeless? She actually subsequently had her baby in Nathan Phillips Square, public square in downtown Toronto. Homelessness changed radically in the 1990s in Canada, both in terms of numbers and it happened because we had a manufactured housing crisis. So we had a devolution of housing policy, and these were choices that the government made at the national level and in many provinces, including the Alberta government, made deliberate choices. Now I want to stop for a second and say that in 30 to 35 years of meeting politicians, I've never actually met a single, well I actually met one politician who said he was happy that there were more homeless people, but I don't think he was actually being serious. I think he was just trying to yank my chain. I've never actually met a politician who said, geez, if you vote for me, I'll make sure you have more homeless people crowding on your streets, and I'll make sure that every year at the Homeless Memorial here in Edmonton, you have 20, 30, 50, 100 names to add to that memorial. They don't work that way, but homeless people become what is sadly called in wars, collateral damage of other policies. Governments decide, let's cut taxes because we want people to have more money in their pockets. And how do you pay for tax cuts? Well, you pay for tax cuts by cutting housing programs. So in 1984, we had a national government elected under Brian Mulroney. And they started to say, you know, we can't really afford all these rich programs, that we can't afford things. And they began to cut. And by the end of the 1980s, we had lost over $1 billion in housing funding. And that $1 billion would have purchased a lot of homes across the country, and every year since then we've lost even more cumulatively. In 1993, the federal government decided to stop funding all new housing under the National Housing Program, and in 1996 the government did what they call stepping out of the National Housing Program. And stepping out, perhaps, I don't want to be a cliched person, but maybe, do people square dance still in this part of the world? It sounds like square dance, sounds like fun, like let's all go step out on a Saturday night with the bar dance. That's not what stepping out is when it comes to housing. It means they're actually abandoning their responsibilities and progressively ending it. And then in 1998, the end of 1998, early 1999, the federal government's National Housing Act, which is the piece of legislation in 1973 which said that it is the duty of government to ensure that people have a home, so that Homes for All is not just a slogan on a sign, but it's actually the official policy, program, and funding of the federal government of Canada. They amended the National Housing Act in 1999, and they said the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is our national housing agency, and isn't it great that we actually have a national housing agency in Canada? Our National Housing Agency, its mandate was changed with the National Housing Act, and it stopped being an agency whose job was to ensure homes for all. And under the NHA amendments of 1998 and 99, the federal government said Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation has to be commercialized, it has to generate revenues for the government. And how does Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation generate revenues? It sells mortgage insurance. It sells mortgage insurance to people who buy homes. For the most part in Canada, people don't default on their loans, their mortgages like they do in the United States. So mortgage insurance is actually an extremely lucrative business because you get all the premiums and you hardly ever pay any money out. This year, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation will be generating profits of over $1 billion from its mortgage insurance business. In other words, it's taking in more than $1 billion more than it's putting out. And you think, well, that's fantastic. It's a commercial center. It's generating money. We've got an extra $1 billion to invest in housing. And no, we don't. Because what the government said in 1999 was we're going to turn Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation into a profit center for the government to finance things. So all that $1 billion or more that goes from revenues goes back in order to finance tax cuts or to do whatever else the government does, but it's not dedicated to housing. Last night I showed you one of my favorite beautiful graphs. I won't go over this again, but just to sort of emphasize the point that our national housing crisis is a manufactured crisis. When politicians cut funding for housing, which meant that low and moderate and even middle-income people started to struggle to be able to find a place to live. By the late 1990s, in my home province of Ontario, about 60 to 70,000 households a year were being evicted because they couldn't afford to pay the rent. And the Ontario government very helpfully brought in some new legislation towards the end of the 1990s. This is an example of how it's not just the federal government, but provinces across the country to fast-track eviction processes. Before 1998, in my home province of Ontario, if you were a landlord and wanted to evict a tenant, you had to go to court, and you had to get a judge to agree with you. And that's actually fairly important because having a home is almost as important as not being thrown in jail, because housing is the basis for our life and our health and so on. So we thought, yes, it's serious enough. You need to have a full-time real judge to decide whether to kick you out. And I used to spend a lot of time in the good old days arguing in front of judges saying, yeah, the tenant's behind in their rent, but it would be wrong to throw them out. And you shouldn't be doing that. The government, however, decided that not only would they take it away from judges, they'd set up a tribunal, and they'd pay the adjudicators who work at the tribunal a fixed amount based on every time they evicted somebody. So when you think about it, you think what they've done is they've created a perfect pipeline. We first canceled the housing programs at the national level, and people are having trouble paying their rent. And then in provinces like Ontario, which used to have robust tenant protection laws, those laws are all stripped away, and all of a sudden we have this great pipeline that succeeds in moving people from housing to homelessness, and that's a manufactured housing crisis. Different provinces have different rules. I know your province, way back in the 1970s, used to have some tenant protection rules that were a little bit better, but they're not so good now. And I pointed out that the consequence of the step out of national housing is not just that the government is shirking its responsibilities in terms of dollars, but it means we're actually going to lose 1/5 from 2007 to 2017. 1 in every 5 federally subsidized homes will be lost. And if you have the misfortune to live in one of those homes and you need that subsidy, good luck to you. Check out your local homeless shelters, because that's where you're headed. In 1998, Dr. Jean Wolfe from McGill University wrote a very important paper summarizing things that had happened over the previous 10 years. And she made this comment, which most of us have now taken on, and it's become a bit of a mantra, that only in Canada has the national government withdrawn from housing. It's not only getting out of managing existing projects and building new. It also took advocates by surprise. I have to say to you that in 1973, when I visited the Minister of Housing in Ottawa, after they had cancelled the National Housing Program, and he said to me that was actually really easy to do. He said, we thought we'd get some flack from Canadians, and the only flack we got was from people like me and some housing advocates because, you know, as he said, we're special interest groups and we're upset. But, you know, for 50 years we built a housing, comprehensive housing plan in Canada that wasn't perfect, but it was good. And none of us imagined that within a decade we could have lost a system that took 50 years to build up. And so social housing policy in Canada now consists of a checkerboard of provincial and territorial policies. It's actually 13 now because, of course, Nunavut has been created since Dr. Wolf wrote her paper. And it's postmodern. So we no longer have this, and I know Jay is going to get into this in more detail, so that's my setup in a moment for Jay. So 2009, this is 20 years after Dr. Wolf made her observation, Milan Qatari, who was at the time the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, he came to Canada on a fact-finding mission, and I was very honored to help organize the civil society portion of his visit. He spent about a month in Canada. He visited, he was here in Edmonton. He visited First Nations groups. He visited and met with people who were homeless and others, collected information, met with governments and so on. And he issued a report. And the two main things he said in his report, it's actually a really good report, and you can find it online, or I'm happy to send you a reference to it. He first of all said Canada has a long and proud history of housing successes and has been known, and in fact still we're known around the world. Whenever I go somewhere and say, I'm a housing guy from Canada, they say, yeah, you're the guys that have all that great stuff, right? So he actually visited these things, and he said, yeah, you guys have done an amazing job. And we've got lots of academics who are smart, and there's maybe a few of them in the room here today. And we've got a good civil society. Civil society is the United Nations term for nonprofit organizations. And you've, of course, got lots of great organizations here in Edmonton that are doing it. So we've got everything that is needed to deal with the housing crisis. We've got a good history of what works. We've got programs, laws, and policies that have been tested over 50 years. And we've got lots of good people in the community. However, he goes on to say there's been a significant erosion of housing rights over the past 2 decades. Canada's successful social housing program has created more than 1 million homes starting in 1973 has been discontinued. So the problem in Canada is not that we're stupid and we forgot how to deal with housing, or that at the local level here in Edmonton, people suddenly sort of said, I don't know, what do we do about homelessness? What do you think? I don't know, what do you think? And that's, again, a setup for Jay. But that's not the problem in Canada, is that we suddenly got stupid. And because we got stupid, homelessness suddenly erupted. It's because governments made choices and policies. So 2010, when the Wellesley Institute issued a comprehensive report on called Precarious Housing in Canada, 4 major observations. There's tons of really lovely graphs and charts, hundreds of pages of great material. It's lovely to sort of on a Saturday night when you get a glass of wine, sit and read this. It's a great way to spend the evening. But the 4 major things that we found were housing insecurity is deep and persistent all across Canada. It's not just a problem in Edmonton. It's not just a problem in Toronto and a few other places. In remote, rural, and northern communities, in Nunavut, in other places, everywhere in Canada. And that's a signal to us that this is not just that you guys in Edmonton screwed up, and that's why you've got bad homeless problems here. It's that we have a nationwide problem, and for a nationwide problem, we need national leadership. That it's costing the people, it's costing people their health and their lives. It's costing communities, it's disrupting communities, it's bad for the economy, and it's bad for government because it's more expensive to manage homelessness, to allow homeless people to drift in and out of hospital, jail, and the other places where homeless people often end up. We, of course, found that federal housing and homelessness investments are eroding, as I've already discussed, and that there's no comprehensive national housing plan. Yesterday, I showed you this chart as well, showing that not only, it wasn't just housing the government dismantled in the 1990s, it was social programs like our income support programs. And because the government's cut seniors' incomes or held back on them and didn't increase them as costs increased, what happened is that our record from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, where we cut poverty in half in Canada, we reduced poverty by 50% in Canada over a 20-year period. And we should be saying, wow, that's fantastic. And if we could do that then, imagine if we just kept doing the same thing, invest in housing, invest in incomes, then we could have gone maybe another 50%, and maybe we could have ended poverty entirely. In fact, it's within our grasp to do that. But in fact, governments in the 1990s reversed course, not just on housing, but on income programs. And the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I mentioned this, if you're not familiar with them, it's called the Club of the Richest Nations of the World. 32 of the richest countries, Canada, United States, Europe, European countries, and so on. And, you know, I know there are a few academics and master's students and so on. If you look at the report, they have a very interesting matrix in which their analytical framework for income inequality. And as you can see, there's lots of boxes and diagrams and stuff, which means it must be pretty smart, right? Because, you know, when you have more than 6 or 8 boxes and colored things and so on, it must mean that somebody spent a lot of time thinking about it. Anyway, the OECD, to be serious for a second, they have the largest department of statisticians and economists of any international agency. They have an office tower in Paris that goes up to the heavens, full of these guys. And of course, in their report that I just mentioned, where they said Canada reduced poverty by 50% in 20 years, and they wanted to answer the question, well, how did Canada do that? Was it because, you know, the goddess smiled down from the mountains of Olympus and said, Canada, I give you my blessings and let poverty... No, it wasn't that. It was because governments made decisions like investing in housing. And they asked, why is it that in the 10 years from 1995 to 2005, almost all of the progress we made reducing poverty was reversed, and we got almost back to where we were in the 70s. And they said two things. Two things explain what happened in Canada. Not the weather, not the gods. It was tax cuts. So giving tax cuts, it increases inequality because the tax cuts primarily benefit wealthier people and profitable corporations who pay taxes and now don't have to pay taxes as much. And in order to pay for the tax cuts, you have to cut spending. So you can't just keep running big deficits in government, so you have to finance your tax cuts. And the OECD said that because Canada in the 1990s cut so many of our social programs, that social spending in Canada relies more on public services, which are things like education, housing, and health, than on cash transfers. So in some countries, the way that they deal with poverty and inequality is they just cut checks, like Brazil. In the developing world, as some people call it, especially in rich countries, Brazil is known for the country which is set among the best records in terms of eliminating poverty, and they did it in a very simple way. They just brought in some new taxes and started giving money to poor people. They call it the Bolsa Familia, and that's a very efficient way to end poverty, is to put money in the pockets of poor people, because they're no longer poor. But in Canada, we stopped doing that in the 1990s, so now things like our social housing program, which is in a constant decline, is one of the last vestiges of our... I really think we've got to grasp this idea of the kind of choices that politicians made and the real impact. So the government, the Stats Canada, has this annual survey they put out called the Survey of Household Spending, and it's a methodology that they use to determine what are the kinds of things that most Canadians spend the most amount of money on. They divide it up into the income quintiles, in other words, the 20% of Canadians who are poorest and the next 20% and so on. What they do is they then figure out what percentage of basic household expenditures are going to cover in various households. If you look here at shelter or housing costs for the poorest 20% of Canadians represents the single biggest expense they have to pay. Housing costs for lower middle income Canadians, single biggest expense they have to pay. Housing costs for middle income and upper middle income Canadians, single biggest expense. So for almost all Canadians, except for the richest 20% of Canadians, our homes are the biggest expense we pay, whether it's rent, whether it's mortgages and all that sort of stuff. It changes, however, for rich people. For the richest Canadians, the single biggest expense they have is income taxes. And that's actually a sign that in Canada we still actually have a reasonably good tax system that does tax people who have more money, which is what the tax system should do if it's a fair system, is tax people. So the poorest Canadians don't pay very much in taxes, income taxes. The richest Canadians, that's the biggest share. So when the government says, we're going to cut housing spending, which means that these people are going to have to pay more money for housing than they already do, in order to give money back to these people here. And then we say, how did it happen that we've got income inequality, and why is it we've got divided rich and poor, and why is it that so many Canadians are being priced out of not only the ownership market, but the rental market, and that's the reason. And then the OECD, the club of the richest nations of the world, not a bunch of radicals in the basement of a library on a Saturday morning who are plotting to change the world. These are statisticians and economists, and I sit as part of a working group with the OECD, and I can tell you they are exactly what you'd imagine a group of statisticians and economists. Even though they're based in Paris, they're really boring, and, but they're smart. And this is what they said for Canada. This was their policy prescription for Canada. They said, and this is very neutral language, so I'll translate it into English so we can all understand it. Reforming tax and benefit policies is the most direct instrument for increasing redistributive benefits. Canada, you've got a problem with poverty. The best thing to do is actually start taxing rich people and putting that money into programs to give to poor people. And secondly, they say that, you know, some people say, well, those poor rich people, they can't afford all that taxation, you know. It's really just awful, you know, for rich people to pay so much taxes. I will just stop for a moment. I almost finished my presentation, but I will just stop for a moment to tell a quick story that every year I get invited to one of the most exclusive private schools in Canada to speak to these very smart young kids whose sons and daughters of the richest people in Canada. I always start off by saying, the single most important thing we can do in Canada to create a better country is to make your mummies and daddies pay more taxes. And of course the room erupts. Do you know how much my dad pays in taxes already? Well, you know, what the OECD says, not me, I'm just a guy standing in the front of the room. The OECD, with all their economists and statisticians and the club of the richest nations of the world, says the growing share of income going to top earners mean this group has a greater capacity to pay tax. They should be paying taxes. So anyway, if you want to, so we've got a national housing crisis and a poverty crisis that are linked, joined at the hip. They're caused by deliberate choices governments make, and governments can actually make other choices to unmanufacture the housing crisis to take us back to where we need to go. What I wanted to actually, I'm just going to go back, sorry, I meant to, this would be a big reveal here. So just down the street at the Convention Centre, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is meeting. And a couple of years ago, they started a campaign called Fix Canada's Housing Crunch, which is a brilliant campaign. This chart shows what I was telling you, that the federal government is stepping out of its housing obligations, and by the year, well, into the 2030s, so by the time you're a young crowd here, by the time all of you have hit your stride in life, I'm hoping that I'm going to just get in there before the federal government cancels Canada Pension Plan, so hoping for it. So anyway, but you guys are going to be around for a while, and you're going to see the end of our national housing program there. Now, all of this sounds, you know, if you go to government and say, raise taxes and use that money to spend it on housing programs and income programs, the government says, whoa, no, that's not going to get me elected. Well, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities did a national survey, and what they found is that 71% of Canadians want a national housing plan. This is tremendously important. 71% of Canadians want it. 66% want increased federal funding. And in fact, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, our national housing agency, used to do an annual survey with Environics in which they'd ask people, do you want more federal government spending on housing? And if it means your taxes would go up, would you still want more federal spending? And every year they got the same result, which was 60 to 70% of Canadians, so they stopped doing the poll because it was getting embarrassing. 73% of Canadians want an increased focus on homelessness. This is not the only organization that's been polling. Canada West Foundation out of Calgary did a similar poll, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and it found almost identical numbers. Canadians want governments to take leadership. They want us to unmanufacture the housing crisis and to move forward. So I'm going to end there and turn it over to Jay. I'm looking forward if there are some opportunities to sort of kicking around some of these issues. And while I'm slowly doing this, we're going to do an effortless technological transfer here.